докладчици. Сега имам удоволствието да дам думата на една още по-голяма творческа група, съставена от колеги от Университета в Нова Горица и Университета в Женева. Данил Христов, Жули Франк, Артур Степанов и Пенка Статева ще представят своите наблюдения, свързани с темата, която на български звучи така: Отвъд съгласуването, приписване на синтактични свойства в реално време. Имате думата, колеги.
So I will be talking about feature selection in the quantified noun phrases in Bulgarian and Russian. And my name is Danil Hристов, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Nova Goрица. Can you, next slide, please? So this is an ongoing project, and the authors are currently working on a joint project between the University of Nova Goрица and the University of Geneva. And the project puts the sorry, I switch on the camera. And the project currently puts existing models of encoding syntactic agreement against new experimental data that pertains to feature assignment. And it explores the role.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think there is some kind of problem with your microphone because the sound is not very good. Thank you. Let's try it this way.
Can you hear me now?
I think it's better now. Thank you very much.
Okay, so basically, the aims of the project are to make important first steps into the cognitive mechanisms underlying the syntactic encoding of feature assignment, and that's in production and comprehension, and also to construct a comprehensive model of feature selection within the DP, the determiner phrase, and to compare it with existing models of sentential agreement. And also there's been a lot of literature on agreement attraction errors in subject-verb agreement in Germanic and Romance languages like English and French, but there is less literature on feature selection is also in Slavic languages, and the project's focus is on this type of languages. And understanding the cognitive mechanisms for manipulating syntactic features might have important practical consequences for the developing of therapeutic tools for language-related disorders. Next slide, please. So Buck and Miller in 1991 showed that people could produce sentences like the key to the cabinets were rusty and the flight with the helicopters are safe. And in these kind of sentences, the verb were and are plural, and they agree with the intervening nouns cabinets and helicopters, which are also plural, and not with the singular subjects ski and flight. And these are called agreement attraction errors. Next slide. So there have been two theories to explain these agreement attraction errors. And one is the linear distance hypothesis, and the other is the structural distance hypothesis. So according to the linear distance hypothesis, errors will depend on the distance as measured as number of words between the intervening noun and the verb. And according to the structural distance hypothesis, errors will depend on the distance measured as number of syntactic units between the intervening noun and the subject. Next slide. So the question is whether we can apply what we know for subject-verb agreement in the case of feature selection. And in order to do that, first of all, we have to consider some similarities and differences between subject-verb agreement and feature selection. So here are some similarities. So both of the processes involve encoding information of features, and they both operate in specifically defined syntactic domains. Next slide. But there are also some differences between the two processes. So agreement is a backward-looking process. So in agreement, the second element, which has overt matching features, needs to have access to the structure that's already been built, and it has to identify the suitable preceding element with the same overt matching features. And this requires the first element to be stored in memory. On the other hand, feature selection, for example, in the case of case assignment, that's a forward-looking process. And in feature selection, for example, in this case, case assignment, we cannot consider the structure that's already been built so far, and the overt feature is only seen once, and it's on the currently considered element. Next slide. So there are also differences in terms of shared overt features between the two elements. So in agreement, the features are expressed overtly both on the second and the first element, whereas in feature selection, for example, in the case assignment, the features are expressed overtly only on the elements that's assigned the case, but not on the case assigner. Next slide. So quantified noun phrases in Bulgarian are a very good environment for studying feature selection. So in Bulgarian, numerals within the noun phrase we'll select a special count form for masculine non-human nouns. And otherwise, an ordinary plural form will be used. In Russian, low numerals from 2 to 4 within the noun phrase will select a genitive singular form, which I will also call a count form. And that's in a specific context, which normally requires a nominative or accusative context, or accusative case. And that's either a subject or a direct object. And in the same nominative or accusative context, high numerals in Russian after 5 will select the genitive plural form. But here in this research, the focus is mainly on low numerals, which select the genitive singular. And adjectives between the numeral and the noun in both Russian and in Bulgarian will have an ordinary plural form and not a count form. So here I'll just give examples with the Bulgarian examples. So in pet grada, we have a numeral and grada is in a count form. In големи градове, we have градове, which is in an ordinary plural form, whereas in pet големи известни града, we have again grada, which is in a count form, but the adjectives големи and известни are in an ordinary plural form. Next slide. Basically, we've planned 40 experiments, and which is 7 for each language. And so here I'll focus on the 3 experiments that we are currently conducting. And these experiments will follow what's called a forced choice response time paradigm. And in these experiments, participants will hear the beginning of a sentence, and they will have to compare it, to complete it, by pronouncing the last word in the correct form. So in the case of Bulgarian, the last target word will be a plural non-human masculine noun, either in a context that requires a count form or in a context that requires a plural form. And in the case of Russian, again, we'll have a target noun, which is in a subject or an object context. And again, it will require either a count form or a plural form. And for both Bulgarian and Russian, the grammatical function, as it will be always the same. It will be either a subject or a direct object. Next slide. So experiment A aims to determine the role of structural depth in intervening modification. So in experiment A, the final noun phrase will consist of a numeral, a masculine non-human target noun, which will follow the numeral. And so participants will have to put this noun in the right form. And there'll be also one or more adjectival phrases between the noun and the numeral. Also, there are two conditions in the experiment. In both conditions, the number of words between the numeral and the noun is kept constant. Next slide. So condition one, there is only one adjectival phrase with a modifier that contains a noun modified by an adjective. Here's an example. We have the single adjectival phrase обожавани от малките посетители. So, три обожавани от малките посетители лебеда. Next slide. So in condition two, there are two separate adjectival phrases between the noun and the numeral, with the first one having a modifier that contains the noun. So if we have три обожавани от посетителите малки лебеда, we have two adjectival phrases, обожавани от посетителите and малки. Next slide. So the number of structural units, or in this case, adjectival phrases, will differ across conditions. The linear distance will be, that's constant. We have the same number of words between the noun and the numeral across conditions. The structural distance, on the other hand, is not constant. The number of adjectival phrases between the noun and the numeral is different. So the target noun is in a context where a count form is required grammatically, but some of the conditions create a bias towards the use of a non-count form. And also adjectives can never have a count form, and they also always have only one possible plural form, and this creates an optimal context for error production. Next slide. So if the linear distance hypothesis is correct, we expect the same number of errors across both conditions, since the number of intervening words between the numeral and the target noun is the same. So we always have 4 words, обожавани от малките посетители, and again 4 words, обожавани от посетителите малки. It's always 4 words. But if the structural distance hypothesis is correct, on the other hand, we will expect more errors in condition 2. So, обожавани от посетителите малки, that would have more errors. Since there are 2 intervening adjectival phrases between the noun and the numeral, whereas in condition 1, there's only 1 intervening AP. So, in condition 2, we have 2 adjectival phrases, обожавани от посетителите and малки, whereas in condition 1, there is only 1 adjectival phrase, обожавани от малките посетители. Next slide. Now I'll talk about the other experiment, experiment B. And experiment B aims to determine the effect of linear distance, structural distance, and similarity on the number of errors. So in experiment B, the final noun phrase consists of a numeral, again, a masculine non-human target noun, which participants have to put in the right form. And also there are adjectival phrases between the noun and the numeral with either a simple or a complex structure. And there are 3 conditions, and in each of these conditions, the adjectival phrase has a progressively more complex structure. Next slide. So in condition 1, the adjectival phrase has a single plural adjective. So we have just to be too many konya, the adjective is just to be too many. Next slide. In condition 2, the adjectival phrase consists of a plural adjective and the modifier with a singular noun and no additional modifiers. So if we have шестопитомени от жената коня, we actually have опитомени от жената, which is, the adjectival phrase. Next slide. And in condition 3, we have a plural adjective and a modifier with a singular noun modified by a singular adjective, which in turn is modified by an adverb. So we have опиту мен от много старата жена. Next slide. So since the modifier is a modifier noun, and it's more adjective or modifier always singular, there is always the one plural intervener between the numeral and the noun. And that means that there is no increase of similarity distance across, no increase of similarity across conditions. And since there is only one adjectival unit to the target noun, there is no change in structural distance either across conditions. And the target noun is in a context where a count form is required grammatically, but some of the conditions creates a bias towards the use of a non-count form. And since the adjectival modifier has a progressively more complex structures and consists of more words in the different conditions, there will be a change in linear distance across conditions. Next slide. So if the structural distance hypothesis is correct, we expect the same number of errors across all conditions, since the number of intervening structural units between the numeral and the target noun will be the same. So we always have a single adjective phrase. Опиту мен от жената, опиту мен от много старата жена. It's always one adjectival phrase. If the similarity affects the number of errors, you'll expect the same number of errors across all conditions, since there is only one plural form between the numeral and the target noun. It's always just опиту мен. And if the linear distance hypothesis is correct, we will expect an increase in the number of errors across conditions, since each condition contains a higher number of intervening words. So in the first case, we have just опиту мен, in the second, which is one word. In the second case, we have 3 words, and in the next case, we have 5 words. Next slide. So here, preliminary results of the pilot project, which was done only on 5 people. As you can see, as the number of errors in each condition increases, so do the number of plural forms, which in this case are the errors. So the condition with a single adjective, which is the one on the left, most on the left, will have less errors compared to the other 2 conditions. And this seems to support the linear distance hypothesis, and errors increase with the increase of the number of the words between the numeral and the target noun. Next slide. And then the last one of the experiments that I'll talk about is experiment C. So experiment C aims to study the directionality of errors and to measure the numeral interference effect. So the final noun phrase consists of an adjective, a noun modifier, which consists of a numeral and a noun, and also a noun, masculine noun, non-human target noun follows the noun modifier, and the target noun has to be put again in the right form. And there are 3 conditions again, and they consist of either 0, 1, or 2 adjectives that intervene between the numeral and the noun in the noun modifier. Next slide. So condition 1 has 0 adjectives. По седените между 2 къщи дъбове, we have always the numeral 2, which modifies къщи and not the target noun дъбове. And there are no adjectives here. Next slide. In the second condition, there is only 1 adjective, and that's ниски. So 2 ниски къщи. Next slide. And in the third condition, there are 2 adjectives, ниски and дървени. Поседените между 2 ниски дървени къщи дъбове. Next slide. So contrary to the previous 2 experiments, here the target noun is in a context where a non-count form is required grammatically, but the presence of a numeral in the noun modifier will bias towards the use of a count form. In addition, an increase of adjectives across conditions will create a bias towards the use of a non-count form. Next slide. So participants are expected to produce errors across conditions due to the presence of a numeral. So in all examples, we have dve, and this will bias the production of errors. And also, the amount of errors should decrease across conditions with the increase of the number of intervening adjectives. So the more adjectives we have, the more participants will use the correct plural form, because adjectives are plural, and not the erroneous count form. Next slide. Yeah, I think this is everything. Thank you for your attention.